Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 300, Huguenots and Catholics. Due to a series of accidents and thanks to her skill, the 41-year-old Catherine de' Medici now found herself the de facto ruler of France. Her foremost desire was to turn back the clock to the early days of Henry II, when the realm appeared to be ascendant. To that end, she set about creating new symbols of royal authority that would harken back to an earlier, more prosperous time, and symbols that would seek to unite a disunified realm. She had a huge new seal crafted for herself as the Governor of France, her new title. Then she had Michel de l'Hôpital confirmed as Chancellor in March of 1561. L'Hôpital was an educated man with legal training that would help Catherine develop intellectually some of the ideas which up to this point had been reached by her instincts, but not by her legal abilities. Her half-formed solutions based on common sense would now acquire a finished elegance. Though her innate ability to understand what a situation required had proved sound enough thus far, de l'Hôpital translated Catherine's will into a form that could be converted into public policy by the state apparatus. He also aided her presentation of her agendas. Through de l'Hôpital, she acquired a polish that frequently left her listeners surprised and impressed. Catherine then went on to make Bourbon the Lieutenant General of France and freed his brother Condé from jail in 1561. These were overt symbols to the people of France that this regime would be different. This regime would not include the Guise family. But, of course, the other issue was France was essentially bankrupt. Due to the pressing financial nightmare that continued to bedevil the kingdom, Catherine needed the Estates General endorsement of her position and to support her desperate need to raise money. Despite the death of Francis II, it had been agreed that the meeting of the Assembly should proceed, and Catherine spent days immediately beforehand reinforcing her position. Guise was still around, and at the head of a small army. Bourbon continued to be docile. Letters went out to the provinces and foreign powers announcing Catherine's new powers and the subordinate role according to Bourbon. The arrival of the constable with 400 armed men suggested he might cause difficulties, especially when Catherine confirmed that Guise remained in command of the army. But Montmorency understood that the change in regime meant that he and his family could expect to prosper much more than they had under Francis II and the Guises. He realized nothing could be gained by agitation at this point. He needed the transition of power to be confirmed first. Thus, Catherine managed to present, at least superficially, a united front to the Estates General when they finally convened. Now, the historic purpose of the Estates General, which is going to take more and more center stage in this show as we move forward, was to, quote, present grievances to the king and the voting of money, end quote. But historically, it had only been rarely, and by the monarch at least very reluctantly, called. To present the factions of Guise, Bourbon, and Montmorency as both loyal and harmonious was essential to the Queen Mother, no matter how maybe incredible of a picture that was projecting. Seated together at the opening ceremony with Catherine and her children, the, albeit incongruous, unity strengthened her image as an effective ruler and sent a message to the estate's potentially troublesome representatives that she had the backing already of the country's most powerful nobles. This was a done deal. In his address to the deputies, de l'Hôpital made it quite clear that the Queen Mother viewed decisions by the crown to be above debate and final. Nor would she hear any claims arising from anything from the past. That was key. It was a done deal. That book was closed. We're not going backwards. Catherine made it clear, we're going forward. It rapidly dawned on the deputies of the Estates General that they had not been called for genuine consultation, but in order to give them money. If Henry II's wars and gifts had depleted King Francis II's cash reserves, his son's short reign left Catherine staring at an empty treasury. Even the usual means of raising money by the sale of offices, however corrupt, had been so diluted that they could no longer contribute anything of substance. Squeezing money from the peasantry during the wars of Henry II had left them so impoverished that the estates were now being called upon to replenish the treasury. Of the three estates that made up the Estates General, the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners, only the clergy felt itself really vulnerable since its riches were still relatively intact. It was certainly the most conscientious estate to pillage. Now, in effect, the new chancellor was asking the Estates General to raise funds and means to give the crown back its independence from itself, and nobody misunderstood what was going on. Once the flowery, legal, and loyal language had all been bandied about, the bare fact remained that this was an audacious ask, to say the least. Since none of the three estates stepped up to offer a solution, de l'Hôpital asked them to consider the proposal he now put to them. His prescription was to raise what are called talés. This is the crown's only direct tax, the burden of which fell upon the peasantry, as the nobles and clergy were both exempt. So the idea was they would raise that for 6 years, and also that the clergy should buy back rents and revenues that the crown had been forced to sell. The only suggestion that emerged from the estates themselves could best be described as unimaginative, which was just simply, the crown needed to tighten its belt. Catherine diligently cut down the number of servants and offices. She lowered pensions and salaries, and was able to then, rather triumphantly, announce a savings of 2.3 million livres. Instead of congratulating Catherine on her endeavors, however, the deputies merely observed that if such a sum could be saved with such ease, could more deep cuts be made? One contemporary wrote of Catherine's efforts as follows, quote, "The greatest of subsidies is the drastic economy which the court imposes on itself in all things," end quote. De l'Hôpital received instructions from the Queen Mother to send the deputies away and to return with an answer in May. Although the financial question had been left without a solution, Catherine and de l'Hôpital congratulated themselves upon the reforms of the judicial system that had been pushed through. In an attempt to alleviate the terrible, and these were bad, abuses taking place in the judiciary, magistrates would henceforth have to be elected, and several other measures were agreed to which would protect the peasantry and prevent abuses, mostly by the other two estates, the nobility and the church. A unification of weights and measures was also adopted, and taxes levied on moving goods from one area of France to another abolished. The further notable decision taken decreed that the Estates General should meet at least once every 5 years. As to religion, the Chancellor pronounced that he considered it impossible to expect accord between people of different faiths. He confirmed his axiom that he would repeat over and over and over again throughout the reign, quote, "One faith, one law, one king," end quote. He added, "Let us not innovate lightly. Let us deliberate long and previously instruct ourselves. If a man may be allowed to adopt a new religion as he chooses, beware lest there be as many religions as there are families and heads of men. You may say that your religion is better. I defend mine. Which is more reasonable, that I should follow you or you follow me," end quote. For all of this reference to orthodoxy, de l'Hôpital's speech nonetheless outlined Catherine's clear break with the Guises' methods of violent persecution. He reminded the Estates General, quote, "The knife is of no avail against the spirit, save to lose both body and soul. Gentleness will accomplish more than rigor," end quote. He spoke of the need of a general assembly of the church council to get to the root of this religious division, and he tried to make it clear that a council would be convoked for this purpose in the very near future. Once again, the Protestants misunderstood this as a measure of toleration. Unfortunately, as a consequence, they grew ever more brazen in their open practice of the new religion, and this would only magnify Catholic fears by damaging church property, smashing sacred statues, and committing other sacrilegious acts. As always, steps towards toleration were meant by religious open expression of toleration, and this only made the more orthodox community react ever the harsher, as we're going to see today. As Catherine's moderate religious policy became clear, an unlikely alliance grew together in a stated effort to keep France's traditional Catholic values firmly in place. This alliance saw the Guise family unite with Montmorency, plus the Marshal de Saint-André, who formed what was called the Triumvirate. The three men intended first to secure France from further Protestant encroachment, and then to go on the offensive, fighting against the Protestant powers of Europe. They had the support of Philip of Spain, the Emperor, and, of course, the papacy. In reality, the three men also had an unstated aim, which was to remove Catherine from power. For the moment, the supporters of these three men only made matters worse, as they took it upon themselves to attack groups of Huguenots, which are French Protestants, I'll get to the term in a minute, throughout the kingdom. After Easter, the triumvirates announced that they were leaving court and would not return. Catherine was furious, but recognized that there was little she could do without the support of either the Constable or the Guise family. This also happened to be when the idea of a marriage between Mary, Queen of Scots, and Don Carlos, Philip's heir, surfaced. Catherine was livid, mostly because she realized that with Spanish support, the Guise family would become basically unstoppable and might easily sweep her and her son aside. So she wrote to her daughter, now married to Philip II in Spain, to do everything that she could to subvert the plan. In the end, both Catherine and Elizabeth I, Queen of England, opposed the match, and Philip didn't have enough strength for another fight, so by April 1561, the project was dead, and Catherine had dodged another bullet, though, as we will see, Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, continued to push for this idea long after it was actually dead. Catherine was eager to get Mary out of France and back to her homeland, Scotland, which, by the way, Mary knew next to nothing about. Ultimately, Catherine got her way. On August the 14th, Mary Stuart left France for Leith, Scotland, never to return. On May 15th, 1561, Charles IX was finally crowned at Reims. It was a muted affair. Economically, the crown could not afford a lavish ceremony. Had it not been for the intervention of the Pope, none of the triumvirs would have gone. But the papacy reminded the Guises and Montmorency that if they continued to absent themselves from court, then Charles would definitely fall under the sway of Protestants. They had no choice. They had to go back. So they did. But they stood at the ceremony, looking surly and unhappy about it the whole time. After the coronation, Catherine worked to bring Montmorency and the Guise family back into the royal fold. She managed to get the Duke of Guise to come back to Paris, but only with the promise that he could lead an annual Catholic procession. In the end, Catherine achieved a cosmetic sense of unity, but the sore beneath the veneer continued to fester. Importantly, Catherine continued to work to shore up her relations with Philip of Spain, because she knew that he was the person who was really supporting the three triumvirs. If she could pull Philip away, then the whole thing might fall apart. And to that end, she always portrayed herself as the model, stern Catholic matriarch, though her behavior in private often suggested that this too was cosmetic. The Queen Mother's daughter, Margaret, would later report that the court was full of heretics. Yet in public, and in her messages sent across the kingdom, Catherine consistently portrayed herself as an ardent Catholic. But the reality was that Catherine's middle position left her looking weak to many. Her advisors consistently urged her to take a harder line against the Huguenots. At least they wanted her to take action that would curb some of the appearances, and I do mean outward appearances, of Protestantism. If Catherine wasn't going to persecute the Huguenots, then she should at very least stop their actions from being so public. That might slow down the simmering conflict. But she did not. On the 30th of July, an edict was announced that offered amnesty for all religious offenses since Henry II's death, with the provision that in the future those persons led, quote, peaceful and Catholic lives. It was yet another stopgap solution. With the meeting of the Church Council that had been promised at the Estates General now only a month away, Catherine felt more optimistic than most that a reasonable solution might be found. To her, God should only be invoked as a protector, not as an avenger. In religious matters, she was no fanatic except when her sons and their birthrights were concerned. The Catholic Mass suited her just fine, a lifelong habit that she found comforting, almost as though it was just a talisman. Unfortunately, she failed to grasp that the burning issues were not tiny doctrinal differences between Christians, but a profound rejection by the Reformers of two fundamental truths upon which the Catholic Church was built: the Eucharist and the doctrinal authority of the Pope. Now, the Pope was concerned about the Estates General as well, and especially the suggestion of a French Church Council. He wanted, obviously, to be in charge of doctrinal reforms. He pressed Catherine to delay the council, with Trent still humming. The Council of Trent, by the way, doesn't end until 1563. Catherine didn't believe that she could wait, and she pressed ahead, telling the Pope that he was welcome to send a representative to the meeting, which he did. Shortly before the church conference, the Estates General met on the 27th of August. The meeting set for May had been postponed due to the coronation. The outcome of the meeting, which had been called to deal with the crown's financial problems, resulted in money being voted to curb the king's financial issues. Most of the funds came from the church, which, fearing even harsher demands being made upon it, offered 1.5 million livres over 6 years, quote, for the redemption of royal domains and of indirect taxes which had been alienated, end quote. A further 7.5 million livres would be paid to settle the king's debts. The financial aid promised was a huge relief to Catherine. With one problem solved, she could move on to the next: the Church Council. The leading Calvinist present, Theodore de Vassy, arrived in Poitiers on August the 23rd. He was believed to be the most reasonable of the Calvinist leaders, though that wasn't saying much because they weren't, on the main, a super reasonable bunch. Vassy met with Cardinal Laurent and spoke at length about various doctrinal issues. While they didn't come out of the meeting with anything concrete, at least they didn't come to blows. Catherine claimed it as a triumph. A few days later, however, this triumph proved to be purely fool's gold. The result of this religious convocation was the so-called Colloquy of Poissy. The Colloquy of Poissy opened in a refectory of a Dominican convent not far from Paris. Seated there on the raised dais were Catherine and her children, the princes of the blood, and the king's council. Along both sides of the room, facing each other, sat the different prelates, the doctors of theology, cardinals, and ministers who were to participate in debate and hear the arguments. The Duke of Guise brought in the meager number of Protestant representatives under guard and placed them behind a low barrier, as if to prevent them from contaminating the rest of those present. As seating arrangements go, it was neither tactful nor auspicious. De Vassy opened with a graceful speech and then proceeded to go straight to the heart of the matter before them. His eloquence lulled the listeners as he moved on to the subject of the Eucharist. He then spoke those fatal words about the host, quote, his body is as far removed from the bread and the wine as heaven is from earth, end quote. There followed a horrified and stunned silence, followed by an uproar and then shouts of blasphemy and scandal. The Cardinal of Turin rounded on Catherine on her raised platform and cried out, quote, how can you tolerate such horrors and blasphemy to be spoken before your children, who are still of such a tender age, end quote. Catherine replied that she and her sons were Catholic and would live and die as Catholic. The Jesuit general, who was present, warned the queen that the kingdom was doomed if she didn't banish the heretics then and there. With de Vassy's words, Catherine's hopes for a compromise collapsed. After a few more days that produced nothing but deeper division and more hatred, the Colloquy of Poissy closed on the 13th of October, 1561. Despite the acrimony at Poissy, Catherine continued to show favor to the Protestants. One explanation, apart from her pragmatism and hopes of unity based on reason, could be put down to simply the conduct of the Huguenots present. While the triumvirs and the Spanish bullied and threatened her, the Protestant leaders and noblemen treated the Queen Mother with the greatest respect, calling her our Queen and making endless loyal professions as French subjects to the crown. This clever policy of appealing to her as their ruler and protector, lauding her wisdom and foresight, gained them a lot of ground and favor. This was particularly true since the Catholic chiefs were frequently absent from the court, sulking at their estates. And if they did deign to appear at court, they were constantly rude to Catherine. In the absence of the war hero Guise and other Catholic icons, the most brilliant Huguenot leaders, such as the charismatic Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, you'll hear of him again, who had been publicly disowned by his uncle Montmorency for his change of religion, they had the stage to themselves. And they proved irresistible to many, and de Béziers received a gracious invitation to remain at court. Indeed, Catherine allowed him to preach to the increasing number of Protestant converts there, among them some of the most important noblemen and noblewomen of the country. Now, of course, the result of all this was that the Guise faction, again, withdrew from court in protest. Now, as they did, they this time attempted to kidnap Edouard Alexandre, Catherine's youngest and certainly favorite child. The effort to steal away her son incensed Catherine. Later on, perhaps as part of a greater plan, perhaps out of a good-natured interest, King Philip wrote to Catherine that she should move her remaining children somewhere where they would be safe from all the strife. She wrote back that the only place she could think of to send them was the Spanish court. This was likely just an effort to smoke out Philip to see if he had a hand in the effort to kidnap the prince. Either way, he declined. During the late autumn of 1561, monks were being killed and churches pillaged in the southwest of France, where the Huguenots held sway. In revenge, Parisian Catholics rose up and attacked Huguenot gatherings. In an attempt to keep the warring parties separate, Protestants were banned from worshiping within the city walls, and not at all on Sundays or Catholic feast days. De Béziers wrote to Calvin that he had secret permission for Protestants to meet in safety and waited for an edict that would give them better terms. Catherine was making a final brave attempt to unite the two faiths. Holding back French clergymen from setting out to attend the Council of Trent, she struggled heroically to find some sort of accommodation. Despite all her efforts, what Catherine failed to see was the sheer passion with which many people clung to their beliefs. For many, there could be no accommodation when it came to their faith. There could be no compromise. For them, Paris was not yet worth a mass. Catherine's last effort at producing a peaceful solution came with the Edict of January. In de Hospital's opening speech before the meeting to discuss it, he put forward the view that he shared with Catherine, affirming that the assembly had not been called to decide which was the best religion, but only the best way to restore the state. He said it was possible to be a citizen without being a Christian. Indeed, it was possible for an excommunicate to be a citizen. The debate and resulting vote took place on the 15th of January, 1562. The edict effectively recognized and legalized the Protestant religion in France, which had hitherto been outlawed. By giving the Protestants even minimal recognition, Catherine now allowed them the right of citizenship, albeit a second-class one. Henceforth, they would be allowed to practice their religion, but only outside town and city walls. Closing the council with an eloquent speech in which she explained her vision and her hope. She reaffirmed that, quote, she and her children and the king's council wished to live in the Catholic faith in obedience to Rome, end quote. Catholics, of course, were furious with the edict, and Parliament refused to ratify it. Even her daughter Elizabeth wrote from Spain, saying bluntly that her mother must either declare unambiguously for the Catholics and receive the support from Spain, or side with the Protestants, in which case she would be Spain's enemy. Finally, Catherine sent her delegates to attend the Council of Trent and argued that the edict must be seen as a stopgap before the council finished its deliberation. Catherine wrote to Philip, hoping to clarify her stance as a firm Catholic and somehow, some way, hold off the impending storm. It didn't work. On March the 1st, 1562, the storm finally broke. The Duke of Guise had been visiting his family estates in the Champagne region during early 1562, and on Sunday the 1st of March, he rode with an armed escort to hear the Mass. As he passed through the small town of Vassy, belonging to his niece, Mary Stuart, he heard singing coming from within a barn that was inside the town walls. A Protestant service was being held, which, according to the terms of the new edict, was clearly illegal. The Duke attended Mass in a church not far from the barn. To his increasing anger, the voices of the psalm singers could be clearly heard as they filtered through the church walls. Whoever provoked the subsequent fight is not clear. The Duke's official version gave it out to a, quote, regrettable accident, end quote. The temples boiled over into a violent struggle between the Huguenots and Guise's men, which left 74 Protestants dead and over 100 wounded. Among the casualties were women and children. Guise himself received a cut to the face, and some of his men were also hurt. The incident became known as the Massacre of Vassy, and it immediately lit the fuse that sparked off what will come to be known as the French Wars of Religion. News of the Massacre of Vassy swept across the Kingdom of France like a great crashing wave. Shortly thereafter, the Duke of Guise was marching to Paris at the head of 3,000 men. Already within the city stood Condé at the head of his own private army of 1,000. At Saint-Germain, when she heard news of the Massacre of Vassy, Catherine made an 11th-hour attempt to stop open warfare breaking out in the capital. She commanded Condé's brother, the Cardinal de Bourbon, governor of France, to order both Guise and Condé to quit the city at once, taking their men with them. Knowing he was secure, though, having 2,000 more men, Guise did not move. But Condé rightly feared for his life and left Paris on March 23, 1562. Catherine then sent 4 emotional letters to him in the last 2 weeks of March, begging him not to abandon either her or the peace of France. In it she wrote, quote, I see so much that pains me, that were it not for the confidence I have in God, and the certainty that you will help me preserve this kingdom, and serve the king my son, I would even feel worse. I hope that we shall remedy all with your good counsel and help, end quote. Now, even at the best of times, Condé never allowed himself to be taken in by Catherine's flattery. The prince now considered it time to arm and fight for what he believed was right. All her appeals were made in vain. Catherine and the court smartly moved to Fontainebleau, but the Duke of Guise arrived there on the 26th of March with 1,000 armed men. He claimed that he had come to protect the royal family and take them back to Paris. Catherine refused, but when the Duke insisted, she had no choice and capitulated. In possession of the king, the Catholic faction was now effectively in control of the government. On April the 2nd, Condé, to the south, captured the city of Orléans. Rouen fell to the Huguenots a few days later. Sides were now being drawn for an all-out civil war. Catherine met with Condé on June 9th, but nothing came from the meeting other than the promise of meeting again. The two did meet again a few weeks later, but it came to nothing. At this point, both sides, Huguenot and Catholic, started to reach out for foreign aid. The Huguenots called out to Geneva and, of course, Protestant England. Queen Elizabeth was at first non-committal, but ultimately signed the Treaty of Hampton Court in 1562 in September. Now, that being said, any help that came from England was only partly assisting the Huguenots out of a desire to help their fellow Protestants. Mostly, Queen Elizabeth just wanted Calais back. To that end, she agreed to send 6,000 English troops who worked to improve fortifications at Le Havre. Catherine and the Catholics sent out their own appeals for aid. Philip of Spain sent 10,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. Swiss mercenaries came in droves to fill royal ranks. But if anything, the first few weeks of what became known as the First War of Religion in France were dominated by atrocities on both sides. especially in the countryside. 200 Protestants were drowned at Tours. In Sens, monks had their throats cut. Even the recently deceased Francis II was not free from the violence. His heart was stolen from its urn and desecrated. By mid-October, Catherine was present at the siege of Rouen, watching her guns bombard the battlements. Guise and Montmorency warned her not to expose herself to danger, but she laughed at their fears, saying only, quote, "My courage is as great as yours," end quote. They did not exaggerate the risks that she ran. When Antoine de Bourbon, occupying one of the forward royalist positions, needed to relieve himself, he wandered into the bushes a little way off from his men and was hit in the left shoulder by a shot of an arquebus. Guise, who found Bourbon knocked to the ground, picked him up and had him carried to the surgeons. At first sight, the wound did not look mortal, but despite what must have been an excruciating exploratory surgeons, as the physicians poked and prodded about, the bullet could not be found. Catherine arrived at Bourbon's sickbed, bringing with her Guise and Antoine's brother, the Cardinal de Bourbon, as a host of doctors and surgeons surrounding him maintained their optimism. However, at some point, it was clear that the doctors were wrong, and a replacement doctor was brought in, who diagnosed the situation correct. The wound was gangrenous. This surgeon later recalled Bourbon's suffering, quote, "It was necessary to open his arm, from which came a smell so foul that many people unable to bear the stench were forced to leave the room," end quote. Unfortunately, no pus accompanied the putrid odor, and the patient grew delirious as his fever steadily rose. He asked to be removed from the unhealthy air of Rouen and be taken up the Seine in a galley. With his end quickly approaching, Bourbon behaved as indecisively in death as he had done in life. Both Catholics and Protestants, eager to claim the salvation of this high prince, surrounded him, arguing over his soul. On November the 9th, he confessed to a Catholic priest, but the following day, regaining consciousness, he declared, quote, "I wish to live and die as a Lutheran." On the night of the 17th of November, 1 month after receiving his wound, death finally claimed him. His last words were to his Italian valet, of whom he was fond. Grabbing the man's beard, he gasped, quote, "Serve my son well, and make sure he serves the king." Antoine's end meant that his 8-year-old son, Henri, became not only the first prince of the blood, but also heir to the throne after Catherine's sons. For this, if for no other reason, Catherine feared the boy. And in time, Henri would also prove himself to be a much more intractable foe than his father had ever been. But for now, at only 8, Henri posed what could be said as only a theoretical challenge to Catherine's power. One of the joys that Catherine had anticipated upon the recapture of Rouen evaded her, however. Gabrielle de Montmorency, one of the key leading Protestant figures, with a handful of men, escaped on board a ship just before the town fell. In a vengeful frenzy, 4,000 rebel captives were put to the sword by royalist soldiers, though Guise tried to put a stop to the worst excesses and keep some of the more valuable prisoners for ransom. More pressing problems now occupied Catherine, however. Despite the royalists regaining the momentum, there was a sudden and real danger posed when Condé and his army left Orléans, marching toward Paris. Guise, who had planned to take Le Havre, abandoned his project and set out immediately with his army in a headlong rush to try to cut the army off before the Huguenots could reach the capital. Guise ultimately did win the race, and Condé turned toward the English troops in Normandy, planning to join forces with them before any major engagement took place. But he was foiled by Montmorency's army, which blocked the route northward, and the Battle of Dreux was fought on the 19th of December, 1562. The Huguenots actually nearly won this battle on what could be only described as a dazzling cavalry charge. But in the end, Guise's arrival meant that the Catholic faction had just way more men, and that they won the day. Interestingly enough, both Condé, a Protestant, and Montmorency, a Catholic, found themselves prisoners by the opposite side at battle's end. The upshot of all of this became that the Duke of Guise was now the unquestioned head of the royalist faction. Catherine wanted to use this victory, which was tactical but not a complete defeat for the Protestants, to start peace talks. But Guise, as I said, now totally in control, decided to proceed on to Orléans and place really the last major bastion of Huguenot power under siege. It proved to be a costly error. On February 18, 1563, while inspecting the progress of the siege, the Duke of Guise was shot in the back by an assassin. He died shortly thereafter. Catherine was at Blois when she heard the news. She was in part devastated because the Duke had been by far her best military commander. But she was also elated because his death meant that his control over her son was over. But in the end, she really realized that the Duke's death made any chance of peace impossible. Now it would be all eye for an eye justice. And matters only grew more serious when the assassin was found and confessed that he had done all he had done on orders from Huguenot leaders. On March the 19th, the Duke received a state funeral, and thousands lined the streets to witness the procession. The assassination of the Duke of Guise set in motion a series of events that's going to culminate in the deaths of tens of thousands of people about 9 years later, though no one knew that yet. Invariably, Catherine's long and often difficult relationship with the Guise family left a cloud of suspicion over her as well. According to the Venetian ambassador, Catherine had once remarked her only regret was that Guise had not died sooner. However, the reality remained that after the Duke's death, Catherine was the undisputed head of the Catholic faction. She truly wanted peace, but recognized that most French were ardent Catholics, and that any agreements that ended the conflict would need to prevent the spread of the Reformed faith. But we're going to leave things with Catherine there, because the death of the Duke of Guise really brings to an end the first phase of the French Wars of Religion. Next time, we're going to go back to England, where Elizabeth is still without an heir, and as we will see, the situation is growing more and more perilous for the English all the while.